Welcome back to the coil winder build. As you can see, since the last video I've made quite a few parts off camera. I chose not to show the making of these because I've covered all of those operations when I made the brass bushings. What I'm trying not to do is flood this video series with repetitive operations and bore people with watching the same thing being done over and over again. This is a shaft coupler for a 1/4 inch 20 threaded rod. It's a 3/8 inch hex stock with a hole threaded through the center. The purpose of these will be to be on the main threaded rod which couples to the crankshaft. They'll push a nylon fender up against the coil form, be it cardboard, ceramic, or plastic, and hold it still while a coil is being wound on it. The nylon fenders will be made out of a large piece of round stock with cones turned on them, and that will allow them to engage any size coil form that I choose, as long as it's large enough to fit on the 1/4 inch threaded rod. I also made a nut out of the same stock which holds the coil spool holder in place. These shaft couplers are 5/8 inch steel with a 1/4 inch hole bored through the center. Each coupler will have a set screw hole drilled at a right angle to the main bore, so I can secure it on any of the 1/4 inch rods. One of them will also have a hole bored so I can make it a crank handle. The crank handle will be made out of a piece of 3/16 round bar. Some of these shaft collars have an eccentric hole in the center that's off center, and that was caused by me not facing off and recentering the round bar after every hole that I drilled. In one specific case, this will be a benefit. I need an eccentric form to tick over the counter lever every time the main crankshaft makes one turn. The counter will go on a specialized bracket in the center. Its function is to keep track of how many turns I've got on the coil. I'll reset it after every new coil. The rotation of the crankshaft will use one of those eccentric shaft collars. Now I've got sheet metal that I'm going to use to make these brackets. I've already used a Sharpie to mark out all of the forms and locate all of the holes. I'll be using a pair of sheet metal scissors to cut out all of these parts. 2 parts go to the counter lever and 1 part goes to the bracket holding the counter itself. I'm going to show the construction of those in this video as well. With all that said, let's begin. Some 30 thousandths sheet steel will form these parts. I've marked it up with blue marker and I've scratched out the lines with a scribe. I've also located the holes that I'm going to punch and drill. This all gets done before they get cut from the main sheet. This piece is a tally counter holder. This piece is a C-channel, which will ride on one of the rods that goes in the back. I've located the holes and punched them with a scribe, but I'm going to punch them with a hammer for better clarity. This hole goes through on the other side, and I'll use it as a guide to drill the other hole. Again, this is the process for punching holes. Locate the divot, tap it with the hammer. It's simple, and it provides an excellent way to locate the hole for drilling. Thanks for your service, Lego book. I'm using this angle iron as a stock to prevent the workpiece from rotating. The idea is that if the drill press grabs it, the big heavy angle iron will prevent it from rotating more than one full rotation. I'll also be using spring clamps to keep the stock still. That way my angle block isn't the only thing that protects me from spinning sheet metal. You're seeing me drill one hole, and you can trust that I'm going to do the same thing 6 or 7 more times on the same piece of sheet metal. I'll be using a wood countersink and a screwdriver to deburr. It's important to get all the little chips off of the edges of the holes. But when my countersink bit is insufficient, sometimes I'll get a larger drill bit and use that. Because the drill bit has a wider angle, it gives a more complete deburr action than the countersink sometimes does. Plus, I'm doing this under power, just giving a little tap from the drill press, vice pushing it in with my hand and turning it. The holes are nice and clean, which allows it to sit flat on the table. This is important when you want to make sure the holes are straight through the sheet metal. On this thin stock it may not matter much because I'm just bolting everything together. By now it's clear I know how to use the drill press, so I'm not going to show all the remaining holes. This middle piece here will be the support for the counter. These two will be riveted into the counter, and these two are going to be screwed into the angle plate. I may just sink some sheet metal screws directly into those holes without enlarging them any further. All those holes are drilled. Now we will be able to go to the next stage, which will be cutting them all out. Since this piece is on the corner, we'll cut it out first. I'll be using some tin snips to cut through the sheet metal. These work just like scissors, even though they require a little more force. Once we make our cuts, we can twist it off. This piece is a little warped, but it's easy enough to fix. We twist off the second piece. This is the C channel, like I said before. Now we cut the long thin piece. You can see easily that they curl when the scissors cut them. Cutting with scissors tends to do that. Because it's such thin sheet metal, we can fix it easily enough. Right now I'm going to flatten it by hand, and I'll perform some fine tuning with a hammer later. You have to watch out because the scissors leave jagged edges and they can cut you if you're not careful. I'm very careful. These pieces will be cleaned up by a bench sander. I'll basically put it on the bench sander and sand right up to the line, removing all of the excess. If you try to cut them off, it just leaves a bunch of waste that's mangled and torn. Using a bench sander with a fine grit belt allows plenty of control and superior results. This one will also need the sanding treatment. You can see me here flattening the piece by beating it like it owes me money. I'm using a brass-faced hammer, which shouldn't mark up the steel. If you look closely, you can see hammer indents anyway, but they're not nearly as severe as they would be if I was using a steel hammer. Now you see me using a file to deburr the corners and also give them a curved profile. You do this by tracing the opposite of the curve with the file. It's a little counterintuitive, but Quinn shows on her channel exactly how to do that, and I typically don't question Quinn. She's full of wisdom as well as a bunch of other great machinist qualities. She's an invaluable asset to the YouTube machinist community. I'm going to use a round object to trace a curve, which you can kind of see here, the scratches on the blue die. I'm going to use that to file out the curve profile that I want after removing the bulk of it with metal scissors. Snip, snip, snip. It's important to walk slowly and deliberately through the shop when holding scissors. You never want to run with these guys. I can't believe I'm telling grown adults this. Now I'll be using a Dremel rotary tool with a rotary file in the chuck. I'm going to remove the rest of the profile and make the curve that you saw me scratch earlier using that oil bottle. The important part is to go slow and take a little bit at a time off. You do this, you get excellent control and you get the shape that you want without much fuss. I don't know if there's a better name for this specific cutting bit, but that's what I'm calling it. As with any other cutting tool, the finished edge needs deburring, but you can see how easily and accurately I cut out the profile that I wanted to. Using a little needle file takes care of the burr that's on that edge. Now we file the other side in the same fashion that we did the first one. Although I don't have a mill, I can appreciate the direction of the cutter versus the direction of the feed in certain cutting operations. And with this one we deburr just like we did with the first one. Using a file we take all the ragged metal off of there, make it nice and smooth. If I wanted to make it really smooth, I'd use a piece of sandpaper. I'll have to remove this corner later, but you get the drift. I've scribed this long piece on the places I'm going to bend it. It's going to bend in an S-curve for a function you'll see later. Because it's thin, I'm not going to use my sheet metal brake. I'm going to clamp it in this vise and tap it with a hammer until it bends to my will. Thin strips of metal like this are easy to bend in the vise. All I need to do is line up the scribe mark, push it over with my hands, and then use a hammer to tap it into shape. When you apply tapping pressure with the hammer, it conforms to the shape of the vise jaws pretty well. It would work even better if I were using soft jaws made of aluminum or copper. This thin steel bends well enough without much force. You can see we've got a nice right angle. Bending the steel also makes it a little more rigid. This would work well if I was building a metal box with it. Putting ridges in the metal makes it stiffer without adding weight. Now you see me lining it up and tightening the vise so I can bend it over yet again. I'm going to bend it in the other direction this time because again it's supposed to form an S-curve. For wider pieces of sheet metal, we'll want to use the brake. I'm going to line up the brake bar with this scribed line, and we'll bend it in small increments. I want to make sure we don't stress the metal or overshoot our angle by bending it all once too quickly. Take our time and go slow. Make sure we get something very close to 90 degrees. And there we go. When you bend sheet metal, it also makes the metal somewhat more rigid without any extra weight. It's a very helpful thing when you're building chassis out of sheet metal. So again, we'll just take our time and go slow and bend a little at a time. I have one right angle. I'm going to line up the other one to make the other right angle. Go a little bit at a time, as blurry as that may be. Just bend it over a little bit, and there we go. We have a channel. This will fit over one of the rods and hold the lever that ticks the counter over. Back to the drill press so I can drill the through hole on this bracket using a dowel to support the two edges. When you drill thin sheet metal on a drill press, thin sheet metal tends to deflect. I'm also using a small piece of 2x4 to support the metal. I'll line up my drill bit, turn on the drill, and start. It should go right through and make a clean hole on the other side. And there we go. Now let's take a look. Damn it. Damn it.